What I'm going to be discussing today is short story structure, and the text that I'm going to focus on is a short story by a fantastic writer, unfortunately no longer with us, called Angela Carter. The story is The Werewolf, and it's from her collection The Bloody Chamber. I also know that there's a copy of the story in the selected short stories edited by Salman Rushdie. Alright, but let's get started. Alright, now it's very important that you plan your short story. Now it might seem like the simplest, quickest thing to do is to just jump straight into it, but I promise you, you will save time if you plan out your story first, ensuring that you've included all the elements of your story that you need, all the structural elements. Okay. Now, if you were going to represent a short story on a graph, it would look something like this. Along the y-axis, we've got our tension and our suspense, and along our x-axis, the story progresses in length and time in the form of words. Okay, so this is what it looks like. Every short story is going to have its own kind of ups and downs, but basically what we want is we want the tension to slowly rise, increasing to a climax, and then to come down slowly in a resolution. Okay, so just put that out there so we can see what that says. Okay, now important elements of a short story. Orientation. To orient is to place in a landscape in an environment. Now, who we're placing in this landscape, this environment, is the protagonist. For, that's how we remember this character, because we're basically behind this character. We're sympathetic towards this character. We're following this character's journey. Now, they might do things that we disagree with, but basically that's our main character and who we hopefully might identify with in some way. Alright, so we're following the journey. In the case of the werewolf, our protagonist is Little Red Riding Hood. She needs to be placed in quite an unusual environment, one that we're not familiar with, so Angela Carter has to spend extra time working on setting up that world. So her orientation is quite long. But for us, for our purposes, presumably we're going to set our story in a more familiar setting, a more contemporary setting, modern setting, so our orientation is only going to be 100 to 200 words. Okay, I mean, if this is basically 1,000 words down here, and this is 500 words about here, then our orientation is going to be, well, hopefully it's done by about 150 to 200 words here, maybe a little bit longer. Every story is going to be a bit different, but you don't want to spend 400 words setting up a story. You want to get it done pretty efficiently. Alright, now the next part is the inciting incident. Now, for a lot of stories, this is when we introduce an antagonist, the person who is in opposition to the protagonist. Now, not every story has an antagonist, but many stories do. There needs to be conflict in a story for a sense of that we've got a sense of rising action, and tension is created when the protagonist and the antagonist are fighting against each other. Not necessarily physically fighting, but in opposition with each other. So the inciting incident in this case, in the story of the werewolf, is indeed when Little Red Riding Hood comes across the wolf as she's walking through the forest. Now, this Little Red Riding Hood is a different creature to the one in the fairy stories that we all have grown up with. This Little Red Riding Hood is very self-reliant, carries her father's hunting knife, and can defend herself. And when the wolf attacks, she cuts off, hacks off the paw of the wolf, who then lollops off into the forest. She picks up the paw and wraps it up in a cloth that she's also carrying some food for her grandmother, and goes on her way. rising action starts to develop as she goes along the forest and ends up at her grandmother's house, and here we have the climax. So a climax doesn't necessarily have to be one moment, it can be a series of moments. It basically takes place at the grandmother's house. When she gets there, Little Red Riding Hood finds that her grandmother is quite sick, and she goes to wipe her brow or to tend to her, and takes out the same cloth that she'd wrapped the paw in, and in doing so the paw falls to the floor. But it's a paw no longer, it's a hand. It's got a hand with a wart on it, and she knows immediately that it's her grandmother's hand. She whips back the bedclothes, and there her grandmother is in bed, fevered, and the bloody stump of her arm reveals that, yes, it is indeed her hand that's now lying on the floor, or Little Red Riding Hood has. So it's revealed then that the grandmother is a werewolf, and that she had been the one that had attacked Little Red Riding Hood in the forest. There's a scuffle, there's a fight, there's screams, there's noise, people come in, the grandmother is dragged out and stoned to death. And then we have our resolution. Little Red Riding Hood takes possession of the house, and the story simply says that she prospers. Okay, so that's the parts of a short story using the werewolf as an example. I hope that's helpful. All the best with writing your story.